In this video, you'll be learning about genetics and inheritance. Now, when we look at genetics, we can look at kind of the beginning of this word, which is the word gene. And a gene is basically a recipe for how to make a protein. A gene is just a segment of DNA on a chromosome that contains all of this information needed in order to make the proteins that make you you. Now, inheritance refers to how you get that genetic information from your parents and how you could pass that genetic information on to your children. So, inheritance has to do with kind of probabilities of what is the probability that you will get a certain trait depending on whether your parents have the trait or not, and also what is the probability of you passing on that trait to your children. So genetics is kind of it's a sub-discipline of biology that studies heredity. So even back before scientists or anybody knew what a gene was or DNA was or meiosis or anything like that, they knew that basically children looked like their parents. They didn't necessarily know why, but they knew that there had to be something that was passed from the parents down to the child in order to make the child look a certain way or act a certain way or maybe have a certain type of disease or disorder. Genetics can also look at things like studying the probability of a genetic disorder being passed on to the next generation. So to talk about genetics, we really have to talk about this guy, Gregor Mendel, who lived back in the 1800s, and he was actually a monk in the Czech Republic. And I guess as a monk, he had a lot of time on his hands, and he enjoyed gardening. And so he started doing experiments with pea plants in order to kind of discover how certain traits were passed from one generation of pea plants onto the next generation. So for example, he would maybe take pea plants that had green peas and breed them with pea plants that had yellow seeds. And then you would see whether the offspring had green seeds or yellow peas, or maybe a mixture of the two. And he did this with a lot of different traits. So he looked at things like the height of the plant, the color of the flowers, whether the peas were smooth or wrinkled. So he looked at a lot of different traits independently to try to figure out how they were passed from one generation to the next. And I find his patience just astounding because in order to do this, he had to take a paintbrush and transfer the pollen from one plant onto the stamen, which is kind of like the female part of the other plant, in order to control fertilization. So he knew exactly which plant was pollinating which other plant. And he did this for like thousands of plants in order to track these patterns of inheritance. And so, thanks to his work and his patience, he actually discovered a lot of the basics of these patterns of inheritance. And so nowadays we kind of take it for granted that we know that there are dominant traits and recessive traits, but that's something that wasn't known prior to Mendel's work. And I find it especially fascinating, the work that he did, because he studied this before chromosomes or genes were even discovered. And so he didn't know what a chromosome was. He didn't know what a gene was. I don't think they really knew much about DNA. Meiosis wasn't really understood yet. So he really kind of came up with these hypotheses for how these different traits are inherited without having a lot of the background knowledge that we know today. And so a lot of the patterns of inheritance that we're going to talk about, we actually call it Mendelian genetics, and that's named after this guy, Gregor Mendel, who did the work to try to figure out these patterns of inheritance. So the basic conclusions that Mendel drew from his experiments are that, first of all, traits are transmitted from parent to offspring independently of other traits. And what this means is that your hair color and your height are inherited independently of each other. So what that means is that everybody with brown hair is not necessarily tall, and everyone with blonde hair isn't short, because you inherit those traits separately from each other. And we now know that those traits exist on different chromosomes. And so it's possible to be blonde and tall, or you can be blonde and short, or you can be brunette and tall, or a brunette and be shorter. So the inheritance of one trait does not necessarily influence the inheritance of another trait. We will learn about some exceptions to this rule later on, but the basic concept still stands. The second kind of conclusion that Mendel drew is that some traits are dominant over other traits which are recessive. And so dominant traits are always seen. So if the dominant gene is present, then we will see that trait being expressed. But recessive traits might be hidden, and that's because they get masked by these dominant traits. And so when we talk about a dominant gene versus a recessive gene, this is what we're talking about. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like on the next couple slides. So let's do a little bit of a reminder of DNA and chromosomes, et cetera, et cetera. So remember that chromosomes are just made up of DNA that is kind of packaged and coiled around proteins. Okay, so your chromosomes are just your DNA, but they're just packaged in a way that makes them a little bit more manageable inside the cell so that the cell can actually do things like copy the DNA and access genes, et cetera, et cetera. And as we mentioned when we talked about meiosis, diploid organisms, remember DI means two, so diploid organisms have two sets of chromosomes, and that includes humans, all right? So humans are diploid organisms. So humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, which we can also say 46 total, but it's kind of better to think of it in terms of 23 pairs. And that's because you're inheriting two copies of every single chromosome that exists. So you can kind of see this picture down here. You can see that if you were to count up these chromosomes, 1, 2, 3, 4, you would get 46 total chromosomes. But notice how they are paired up. So you've got chromosome pair number 1, chromosome pair number 2, number 3, number 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, etc., all the way down to pair number 22, and then the 23rd pair are actually the sex chromosomes. So chromosome pairs number 1 through 22 are called autosomes. And autosomes are just the chromosomes that carry kind of like the general genetic information on how to make a human. So autosomes are kind of like the general genetic information. Now the 23rd pair are the sex chromosomes, and so these are a little bit different because they act a little bit differently from the autosomes. They're not also truly homologous. So the sex chromosomes are, or I guess the two possibilities of sex chromosomes that you can inherit are either an X or a Y. And ultimately what happens is that if someone inherits two X chromosomes, that is an individual that is genetically female. So two X chromosomes code for the development of the female physiology. Now, if someone inherits an X chromosome and a Y chromosome, it means that that individual is genetically male. And so those chromosomes carry the information needed in order to produce the male physiology. So the X and the Y chromosomes are they're not truly homologous. And if you look at this picture back down here, you can see that the X chromosome is significantly bigger than the Y chromosome. And so they actually carry very different genes on them. So when we talk about homologous chromosomes, we have to kind of ignore those sex chromosomes because they don't really follow that rule. But these homologous chromosomes that we've talked about before have to do with the autosomes, which we see in pairs number 1 through 22. So remember that homologous chromosomes, these are those paired chromosomes in which you get one from your mom and one from your dad. Now, remember that homologous chromosomes are similar, but they are not identical. And this is really important because they carry the same types of genes, but they might not carry the exact same recipe for what that trait will look like. So if we look at this picture down here, we're looking at a pair of chromosomes. So we could say that this is, let's just pretend like it's chromosome number 1. And we've got copy 1 of the chromosome and copy 2. And let's just say that copy 1 came from mom. And copy 2 we can say came from dad. So even in this example where we're looking at flower color, so we're looking at plants, but plants also have sex. So that's basically what pollen is. So when you have allergies in the spring and you inhale and you sneeze, basically what's making you sneeze is plant sperm in the form of pollen. All right. So plants are also diploid organisms, very similar to humans. I mean, obviously there are some difference, but they're similar in the sense that they are diploid organisms and they have these paired chromosomes. So if we're looking at a pair of chromosomes in which we've got 2 copies, one came from the mom plant and one came from the dad plant, and you'll notice that we have this kind of this trait here. And so we've got this kind of this one copy of the trait that says that the plant should have purple flowers. But we have another copy of the trait that says that the plant should have white flowers. So the trait that we see on these chromosomes are the same. The trait is for flower color. But we have 2 different variations of that trait. And those variations are called alleles. Right, so you can see here it says allele for purple flowers and allele for white flowers. So the alleles have to do with what, kind of more specifically, what color is that flower. So the alleles, we have one option of a purple flower, or we could end up with white flowers. Now we can apply this to humans as well. Okay, so let's say that we've got mom, and let's say we've got chromosome number 1, 2, and 3 from mom. And then let's say we've got chromosome 1, 2, and 3 from dad. All right, so we've got chromosome number 1, number 2, and number 3. So these are homologous chromosomes. Now on, let's say chromosome number 1, we might have this trait or this gene for eye color. And then the alleles would be the options. And so in the example we have kind of up here, the options could be either blue or brown eyes. Now we could say that on chromosome number 2, maybe there is a trait for, we'll say height. All right, so maybe the gene codes for the trait of height. And then the alleles might be short and tall. The third chromosome might have a different type of allele. Maybe it's hair texture. So the trait could be hair texture. And then the alleles are the options. And so maybe the options are straight versus curly. So straight or curly hair. All right, so in diploid organisms, every pair of chromosomes carries a pair of alleles. And so these 2 alleles are just the 2 possible options for how this trait could be potentially expressed. So we kind of mentioned in previous examples, I've talked a little bit about the recipe for cupcakes. So we could apply this to our example here. So we could say that we've got 2 chromosomes, and on these chromosomes we have a kind of a recipe for cupcakes. Now, one might have the recipe for chocolate cupcakes, and one might carry the recipe for vanilla. All right, so we still have two recipes for how to make cupcakes. We just have these two different variations where we could end up with chocolate cupcakes or we could end up with vanilla cupcakes, depending on which recipe we decide to follow. When we talk about genetics, we have to talk about these two terms known as genotype and phenotype. So let's actually start with phenotype. And phenotype is the observable trait of an organism. So I put down here, it's what you can see. Now, see is kind of a relative term because this might be a microscopic or even submicroscopic. It might be a molecule that's being made in your body that you can't necessarily see with the naked eye. So maybe a better way to kind of say this is that it's the trait that is expressed. And so it is what becomes part of you. And so the phenotype is the kind of the outcome. So for example, blonde hair, brown eyes, curly hair, tall, size 10 shoes, resistance to certain diseases, intelligence. So all of these things are kind of the expression of the genes. And so the phenotype is what you actually see, what actually gets expressed by your genetics. So it's kind of the outcome, it's the physical thing that you see. In the example with flower colors, the phenotype options are purple or white. All right, so we can either end up with purple flowers like we see in these first three options here, or we could end up with white flowers. And so that's the phenotype. So we can see what this flower color is, even if we don't know what the genetics are behind it. The genotype is kind of the mysterious, unseen force behind the phenotype. So the genotype has to do with the genetic makeup, and you can kind of see that in the words of geno for gene and gene and genetic makeup. And so an individual's genotype is basically just what are those two alleles that they inherited. And remember that the two alleles are just the variations of the gene. And remember that the two alleles come from the homologous chromosome. So you have two alleles because you have two chromosomes that are homologous to each other. And so you get one allele from your mom and one allele from your dad. And thanks to sex, these alleles come together and they make up your genotype. So your genotype was determined by the kind of the arrangement or the types of genes that were on the chromosomes in your dad's sperm and the types of genes that were on the chromosomes in your mom's egg. Now we have three possible options for genotypes. So an individual can be homozygous dominant, heterozygous, or homozygous recessive. And we'll take a look at these terms a little bit more closely on the next slide. When it comes to genotypes, there are three possible combinations that an individual can end up with. And the genotypes are actually specific with regards to the trait. So someone might be homozygous dominant for one trait, and they might be heterozygous for a different trait. So let's first take a look at these words and kind of break down what they mean. So first of all, if we look at the prefix homo, homo means same. And you'll notice that we have two options that are homozygous. And so in both of these, it has to do with something being the same. Now the word zygous has to do with zygote. And you'll notice that all three of these have that as kind of the suffix to the word. So for homozygous, we're talking about a zygote that has the same copies of two alleles. Now, just kind of a reminder that a zygote is just a fertilized egg. So we've kind of drawn this before, where we've drawn an egg where you get some genetics from mom, and a sperm where you get some genetics from dad, and they combine in order to form a zygote. And then that zygote goes through mitosis in order to develop into an embryo, and then eventually into a fetus, and then eventually into an infant, and then a child, and a teenager, and an adult. So we're talking about the kind of the combination of the types of alleles that could be inherited in this zygote. So in the case of homozygous dominant, what this means is that the individual inherits two dominant copies of the allele. So the individual inherits two dominant copies of the allele. And what this means is that mom had a dominant copy, dad had a dominant copy, and when those homologous chromosomes lined up, both of the alleles ended up being dominant. So if we were to draw a pair of homologous chromosomes here, where one came from mom and one came from dad, and we have our two alleles for the trait, both of these alleles would be dominant. Now let's jump down to the homozygous recessive option, since it kind of goes along with the homozygous dominant. So the same thing with homozygous recessive. Homozygous just means that the zygote has two copies of the allele that are the same. The only difference is that now the zygote has inherited two recessive copies of the allele. An individual inherits two recessive copies of the allele. So both of the alleles, one on each homologous chromosome, those two alleles are both going to be recessive for whatever trait you're talking about. Now if we go back up to the second option here of heterozygous, hetero means kind of different or other. And so in this situation, an individual would inherit one dominant allele and one recessive allele for the trait. So the individual inherits one dominant allele and one recessive allele. Now, typically when we're talking about a trait, we use a letter that is associated with the trait to we kind of like assign a letter in order to help us kind of visualize how that trait is passed from one generation to the other. And so we can use those letters to kind of signify whether something is homozygous dominant, heterozygous, or homozygous recessive. So I'm just going to use the letter B. That could be a trait for really anything. We could say eye color or something like that. And so how we would assign these letters is that someone who is homozygous dominant would be given two capital B's. So the capital B indicates that it's dominant, and the fact that there's two of them that are both dominant means that it's homozygous dominant. Now for someone that's heterozygous, we could write that as a capital B and a lowercase b. And that indicates that the individual has one dominant allele and one recessive allele for the trait. Now in someone homozygous recessive, you've probably guessed that that person would be assigned two lowercase b's in order to show that that individual has two recessive copies of the allele. I mentioned briefly earlier that genetics and inheritance is really a study of statistics. And so statistically speaking, what is the probability that somebody would inherit one trait over another trait, or the probability that someone would end up with a particular phenotype. So we can use something called a Punnett square, which is this picture down here, in order to help us kind of figure out what the possible combinations of genotypes are. And the way that these work is, remember that you get a chromosome from your mom and a chromosome from your dad. And you've got 22 pairs of these plus the XY sex chromosomes. And remember that during meiosis, right? So during meiosis, and actually it was during meiosis 1, the homologous chromosomes separate. So, for example, in the cells in your body, your cells contain these homologous chromosomes. But during meiosis, your body takes those chromosomes and it separates them. And so the gametes, so the eggs or the sperm that your body makes during and after puberty, is really it's just taking the chromosomes that you got from your parents and then shuffling them up. And so remember that one homologous chromosome is going to go into one gamete and the other homologous chromosome is going to go into the other gamete. So, for example, let's say that this individual had 2 dominant copies of a particular trait. And so we'll just give that trait the letter A. So that means that during gamete production, the individual, so let's say that this is you, all right, so let's say that this is you right here. So during gamete production, during meiosis, what happens is that you're going to end up with some gametes that have the chromosome from your mom, and you're going to end up with some gametes that have the chromosome from your dad. And there's a 50-50 chance that each of your gametes are going to get either a copy from your mom or a copy from your dad, because you've got 2 of them, and so one of them is going to go into one gamete and the other is going to go into the other gamete. So now we can apply this to the Punnett square over here. So let's say that you are a woman and you are interested in having a child with your partner. And so you're trying to figure out, based on your genetics and your partner's genetics, what is the probability that your child might end up with a particular trait. So the way that we can do this is that we can kind of on one side of the square, we can put the mom's genetics. All right, so we can even draw these as eggs, because remember that these are gametes that are being formed during meiosis. All right, so these are eggs. So in our example over here, this individual would have gotten a dominant copy from mom and a dominant copy from dad. And so basically this individual's eggs are all going to have the dominant copy of the allele for whatever this trait is that we are studying. Now let's say that your partner, so we can draw some kind of like little sperm over here. And let's say that the partner is heterozygous. And so the partner has a dominant copy of the allele and a recessive copy of the allele. So we can designate that as a capital A or a lowercase a. And once again, these little drawings are supposed to be sperm. So what happens when this sperm fertilizes this egg? What we end up with is a genotype of capital A, capital A. And this could also be called homozygous dominant. If we were to take that same sperm, but instead fertilize this egg, we would still end up with the same combination. Now, if this sperm carrying the recessive trait were to fertilize this egg, we would end up with an individual that is heterozygous. And the same thing would happen if this sperm fertilized this egg. We would end up with another heterozygous individual. Now, this Punnett square is based on the individual having 4 babies, all right? But it's pretty rare that an individual would have 4 babies at one time. It does happen, but even if it did happen, um, each individual fertilization event is its own event. So we have to kind of treat each offspring as being kind of independent of the other offspring. So let's say that this person is not having 4 babies, but they're just having 1 baby. So what is the probability that the baby will be homozygous dominant? What's the probability that the baby will be heterozygous? What's the probability that the baby will be homozygous recessive? And so the way that we can do that is essentially each one of these squares is equal to 25%. Because we're basically taking 100 and dividing it by 4, which gives us 25%. So in this cross, this kind of example cross that we ended up with, the outcome is that this man and woman having this baby, they have a 50% chance of having a child that is homozygous dominant for this trait, and they have a 50% chance of having a child that is heterozygous for this trait. Now, we're going to do more kind of examples of these Punnett squares in the future. So if you're confused, it's okay. We're going to get more practice with them. But this just kind of introduces this general topic of how we can kind of figure this out.